Well, hey everybody, good morning and welcome to session 37 of our verse-by-verse study through the book of Genesis and our virtual life Bible study here at City on a Hill. My name is Pastor Derrick. Welcome back once again for another round of some fun in arguably my favorite book of the Bible. The book of Genesis is so much fun, and we are kind of at the end portion of Joseph's narrative, which interestingly enough, at the end of his narrative, really becomes more about Jacob again. And it's one of the things that we see here this morning, that our passage today, Genesis 46 verses 28 through 47 verse 12, is really more than anything, I feel like, about Jacob. It kind of takes a trek back to Jacob and his story, and for a lot of good reasons. We see Joseph and Jacob reunited for the first time. We see Joseph bring his brothers and Jacob before Pharaoh. And this kind of paves the way for how the Israelites end up in Egypt. So when you start the book of Exodus, it starts with another Pharaoh who is in command at that point. This is several hundred years after the time of Joseph. And things are not going as well in Egypt as they were beforehand. This is a particularly evil king, an evil Pharaoh. The Israelites are multiplying a great amount, and this becomes a threat to Pharaoh, and this sort of opens up the drama, the conflict, if you will, for the opening portion of Exodus that leads God's people eventually out into the wilderness and ultimately to Canaan, to the promised land. Back to Canaan, interestingly, because if you remember today, as we are reading how Joseph brings his brothers and Jacob back, they are coming from the land of Canaan that they were in previous to the land of Goshen, which is where they end up, a place in Egypt. It's interesting, there's this whole conversation that Joseph has with regard to giving the right information to Pharaoh. And when you read that passage, it can kind of seem almost like he's being dishonest or deceptive, and he's really not. He's coaching them to say the truth, but to give all of the right details in order to hopefully end up with the right portion of land, which is, as I said, the land of Goshen. Before that, we see Joseph and Jacob's first time to meet in almost 20 years. It's been almost 20 years since Joseph has been sold into slavery to the Ishmaelites and brought into Egypt, where he goes through Potiphar's house, his accusation from Miss Potiphar, his time in prison, his time interpreting the dreams of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and then more years pass, and then Pharaoh's dream comes, and then there's 7 years of plenty, and then they're in the second year of famine when this happens. There's 5 more years remaining of famine left, and so several years have passed, and Joseph and Jacob meet. Judah is sent ahead of Jacob. They meet in the land of Goshen, which is where they're hoping to end up. Joseph meets them there. The land of Goshen is later called, actually in verse 11 of chapter 47, the land of Ramesses. This is a place that eventually becomes the home of the 19th dynasty of Ramses in 1400 BC, several hundred years after the Exodus. We're not entirely sure. Some scholars think that the land of Ramesses is connected to the name Ramses. They're spelled differently. It could also just be an Egyptian word that means Ra has created it, probably more likely given the disparity in spelling, and Ra being one of the Egyptian gods that were revered during that time. It was a fertile area, fertile strip of land in the eastern part of the Nile River Delta, including Lake Timsah. And it provides one of only 2 passages from Egypt and Sinai. And so it's a really great piece of land. It's perfect for grazing, which is what Joseph's family needs. They're shepherds, they're keepers of livestock, which we come to talk about here in a moment. Joseph's reaction to seeing Jacob is very emotional. He falls on his neck and weeps for a good while, is what it says. Jacob's response is a little different. It's a little surprising, actually. Jacob is someone who, as we've seen through his narrative, been a pretty relatively emotional guy. When you read through his story, he weeps when he first meets Rachel before he marries actually Leah and then eventually Rachel. But in Genesis 29:11, upon seeing Rachel and knowing that she's the woman that he's going to marry, he kisses her and then weeps out loud. His reunion with his brother Esau after several years that he thinks is going to go very badly ends up going very well. He weeps upon seeing him. That's in Genesis 33, verse 4. He tears his clothes and mourns for several days at the news of what he believes is the death of Joseph. Of course, as we know, it wasn't. But he's a guy who seems to react emotionally a lot. And that's not a bad thing. He's just someone who is an emotional guy. And when he finally meets Joseph, has this reunion with Joseph after almost 20 years, there's no weeping, there's no crying, there's no emotional outburst. And while the text doesn't say this explicitly, it almost seems like the years of grief have hardened him. Like there are just no more tears left. And grief can be a difficult thing. We're going to be talking about that here in a little while in our group discussion. But that kind of is proven out, I think, even more in verse 30, where he says, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." I mean, it's like I have finally seen the questions that I had regarding your death have been answered, and I can die in peace now. But there's no real sense of emotional joy. It's more of just relief that nagging question of what happened to my son has finally been answered. It kind of echoes Simeon's words in Luke chapter 2 upon seeing the infant Jesus brought into the temple. He says in verses 29 and 30, "Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation." I finally have answers to this question that has been gnawing at me. You have finally let me see the Messiah. I can now die in peace. It's interesting that while it seems like he's ready to die here, he goes on to live for another 17 years. So he's nowhere close to his death at this point. Joseph's plan for his brothers, I break it down into 3 sections, or really 2 sections. First, Joseph is going to go and interact with Pharaoh himself. He's going to tell him that his brothers and his father are shepherds and keepers of livestock. These are interchangeable names. Keepers of livestock being a more general term that would have included cattle as well as sheep, which shepherds would have only included sheep. So they were practicing the animal husbandry of more than just sheep, more animals than that. So they needed a lot of land. The brothers are brought before Pharaoh, but interestingly, only 5 of them are brought before him. They are not given, there's no reason given for why only 5 of them are brought before him. There's several traditions that give different reasons for this. One is that perhaps he chose the 5 most competent brothers that he knew would give the information that he was directing them to give the most convincingly. There's another rabbinic tradition that Joseph chose the weakest of the brothers, the littlest, the most fragile looking of the brothers, so that Pharaoh wouldn't try and recruit them into the Egyptian army, try to bring them into war. Regardless of the number, there's also likely another reason, and that is that 5 seems to be a prominent number throughout Joseph's narrative. It likely corresponds to the 5 sets of garments that he gave to Benjamin in chapter 45, verse 22, as well as the 5 servings of food for Benjamin in 43:34, and the 5 remaining years of famine in 45, verses 6 and 11. So that seems to be kind of just this repeated theme that happens. And for some reason, the Joseph and the Benjamin connection there brings that number out a lot. The passage closes with Jacob giving a blessing to Pharaoh, and I think this is a fascinating part of the story. In fact, probably the most fascinating part of this study. Pharaoh asks Jacob how long he's lived. He recognizes that Jacob is pretty old, and being an old man or woman in the ancient Near East was something that came with a lot of reverence and respect, because to live that long almost certainly was equated with divine intervention or divine blessing. It was believed that you couldn't live that long unless God was really blessing you, because there was no modern medicine, there was no preventative measures for a lot of the things that we take for granted now, but killed a lot of people back then. And so the fact that Jacob is an old man, Pharaoh recognizes that and knows the hand of God must be upon this guy. Verse 10, though, is the one that I think is just so great. Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. The question is, why does Jacob bless a pagan king? Why does he bless this man who is clearly not a follower of Yahweh, who clearly has no interest in being a follower of Yahweh? And when I think about that from a modern context, from an application standpoint, it would be like us blessing a foreign leader as a Christian, praying for God to bless the president of Iran. or the president of some other country that has nothing to do or no interest in the Christian faith whatsoever. Why does Jacob do this? And I think there's a couple reasons for this. One, because Jacob recognized that Pharaoh was a gracious man. He was doing things for their family that he did not have to do. He was not obligated to do. As Pharaoh, as king, he did not have to do anything for them. And the fact that he did anything, much less a lot of things, like give them riches and livestock and clothing and chariots and the most fertile land in all of Egypt. I mean, there's so many reasons for why you could say Pharaoh was a gracious man to Joseph and Jacob and their family. So I think Jacob recognizes that and blesses him for that. And I think there's an application there for us as well, that just because someone is a non-believer, that we need to recognize kindness, that we need to recognize generosity, and pray for those people, pray for blessing for those people. I think that oftentimes we feel like we're not allowed to do that if they're not Christians. And it's not up to us for them to become Christians one way or the other. And so when we recognize kindness and generosity, it ought to be recognized. It ought to be actually publicly recognized and something be said about it. I think that's just a good practice for Christians to engage in. Beyond that, I think there's a connection here to Abraham. Jacob, as you know, we learned last time, is the heir to the Abrahamic covenant. God says that he will make many descendants or many nations from him, which is almost a direct echo from the first part of chapter 12, when God promises Abraham all of the promises that come with the Abrahamic covenant. And Isaac was the heir of those blessings, and now Jacob is the heir of those blessings. And God said specifically in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And so I think, if I'm just guessing here, again, the text does not explicitly say this, but what it looks like is happening is that Jacob is learning to bless those whom God will bless. Jacob knows God is going to bless you because you have blessed us, and that's what he promised as a part of the Abrahamic covenant. Those who bless you, I will bless. Jacob knew God was going to bless him for that. And so I think that this is, again, it goes in line with what I was just talking about, blessing those when we recognize kindness or generosity, knowing that as heirs of the Abrahamic covenant, which is an everlasting covenant, by the way, and that we are sons of Abraham, daughters of Abraham, if we are in the new covenant, that God will bless those who bless us, and he will curse those who curse us. Maybe not in our lifetime. We don't always understand what it's going to look like. But I think when we can learn to align ourselves with the will of God, which is ultimately what the New Testament overwhelmingly is teaching, that when I am in him and his words are in me, ask whatever you want and it will be done for you. And this is what he says in John's gospel, that we're aligning ourselves with the will of God such that whatever I ask for, God will give because it's his will. It's not my will. So just asking God for whatever I want or doing whatever I feel like and asking God to bless it, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is when you recognize that someone is blessing you, when they're being kind and generous to you, we must recognize that God in Genesis 12:3 says, this is the blessing, the promise that I have for those who are a part of my covenant family. I will bless them. And Jacob recognized that, and he in turn blessed him as well. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. If it is, then read the study. I think I made it maybe a little simpler in the study. The group discussion is over grief and what grief does to a person, how it invades our life, hardens us to, I think, really important emotional output as believers. It ultimately stands in opposition to spiritual intimacy as well. So there's some great questions here for y'all to talk through as a group, and I don't want you to skirt these. Part of the vision here is that we are opening people up, yourself included, to being transparent, being vulnerable. And maybe for a long time you thought, you know what, I don't need a freedom group. I'm not an addict. I'm not one of those people. And we've been saying for as long as you've been thinking that, freedom groups aren't for addicts. They're not for broken people. Well, they are for broken people, but they're for every person because every person is broken. And so this affords you an opportunity to begin sharing at a level that maybe you would more expect in a freedom group, but in the context of a Bible study, because it's something that we see happening in the Bible study with one of the key players in this story. And so it allows you to sort of connect with maybe what Jacob was feeling how he was feeling, or his lack of feeling, because of the grief that no doubt struck him when Joseph was taken from him. So get honest with one another. Share. Use this as an opportunity. The Holy Spirit will guide this discussion if you will allow Him to, and He will reveal to you things that maybe you weren't even aware of, both through your own sharing and through the sharing of others. And so I really encourage you to get honest, get transparent, be vulnerable, and allow God to do His work in your life. This is why we do Bible study, so that God will transform us from the inside out. This is a great opportunity to do that. Praying for you this week. Hope you're having a great week, a blessed week. Hope to see you on Sunday in person. We've got a lot of really fun events happening over the course of the next month, so be sure to check out our morning show, Good Morning City on a Hill. It airs at 8:30 every Sunday on our Facebook page, and it's saved, so if you've missed them, you can go back and watch them. We've brought in Aaron and Chris, our youth pastor, and now Chris, our community pastor. We brought in Emma, our children's minister. We brought in Brian, Freedom Group's minister, last week. All these pastors on our staff that maybe many of you are not as familiar with. And then this coming Sunday, we're going to have a very special guest on there as well, with a special song. And you're going to really enjoy it. It's going to be a really fantastic time. So check that out. Tune into that as well. Get caught up on what we're doing. We will see you next time we see you. God bless you. Have a great day.